So if you own an 09 to 18 Ram 1500 and it's got the 5.7 Hemi under the hood and you're looking for one of the most affordable cold air intakes to make some decent power without actually tuning your truck, you should be checking out the Series 63 AirCharger cold air intake from K&N. Now K&N's been around longer than I've been alive, and because of that, they do a pretty good job of making some decent power without actually requiring a tune. We actually ran our truck on the dyno bone stock, and our truck made 288 horsepower and 280 pound-feet of torque. Then went ahead and installed the Series 63 AirCharger. We left everything else the same. Our truck ended up making 298 horsepower and 301 pound-feet of torque. That makes for some pretty impressive gains of 10 horsepower and 21 pound-feet of torque at the peak. Now, if you take a second look at those graphs, though, you'll see some pretty nice curve gains. Those curve gains are really nice because that's what you're going to feel when you're driving around. Other reason I really like the Series 63, besides the price and the performance, is how easily it installs. This is an open element design, so it completely changes up the way the Airbox sits. However, it reuses all the factory hardware and it installs the way that the original intake is installed on the truck, so there's no custom modification required to install this intake. For that reason, I'm going to give the install very easy, 1 out of 3 wrenches on my patented difficulty meter. It should actually take you about an hour to install this with basic hand tools, so it's a great first mod if you've never done anything to your truck before. So again, if you like the price of the Series 63 and you want to make some decent power without really having to turn a lot of wrenches, you should stick around. I'm going to show you guys how to install this intake in just a moment. To install your new K&N intake, you'll need the following tools: a 10mm wrench, a standard drive ratchet, an 8mm socket, a 10mm socket, a 13mm socket, a 3mm Allen key, a 4mm Allen key, and a cutting tool. Optional but helpful tools include extensions and swivel sockets, a cordless impact, and a small pry tool. So before we install our new intake, obviously we have to remove our factory intake. It's pretty straightforward. The only tool you'll need for this is an 8mm socket to loosen the clamp holding the intake tube to the throttle body. Once you've loosened that clamp, you can disconnect your intake temperature sensor on the intake tube. You also want to disconnect the breather hose on the Airbox, and then you can actually pull the entire assembly out of the vehicle as one piece. So once you got your factory intake tube removed, the next step is pulling your engine cover and removing the crankcase ventilation hose from the engine side. Now the instructions do say you do have to cut that hose. We've actually found a way to avoid doing that. So once you pull all this stuff out, go ahead and put that hose aside and I'll show you guys what to do later. So now that we have our factory intake removed, as well as our breather hose and engine cover, we can finally start assembling our new K&N. But before we do that, I wanted to point out some cool differences between these two. Obviously, the big factor here is we're going from this ugly closed plastic box to an open element design with the very cool conical filter that K&N is known for. I think it really cleans up the engine bay, makes it look a lot better. I'm also not a fan of the factory plastic on this box. I really like the metal that they use for the heat shield here. It's got a nice black powder coat finish, so it blends in well, but it honestly just looks a lot better because it has a cool textured finish to it, and the same applies to the new K&N intake tube. Now before we fully discard our factory Airbox and tube, we do have to pull our factory intake temperature sensor. This is hand tightened on plastic, so just take your time, go ahead and hand loosen it. You don't need any tools for this. Once you got that intake temperature sensor pulled, you can actually discard the factory intake tube and box completely. Now obviously we have to install that temperature sensor on our new intake tube. K&N provides you with a little rubber grommet, and it's the same deal. All you gotta do is hand tighten it. You don't have to use any tools for this. So now that you got your temperature sensor in your intake tube, you can set that aside. Next step is setting up your new Airbox. Depending on what model year your truck is, will dictate which of the plates that you're using, as you can see in front of me. Pretty easy. If your truck is a 2013 or newer and it has those AC lines running near the factory Airbox, you're gonna need the one with the cutout. In our case, we're using a 2014 Ram, so that's the one we're gonna go with. Now to secure the plates to the Airbox, it's really easy. All you're gonna do is grab the Allen head bolts in the kit. You're also gonna need a small Allen key, and you're gonna fit those bolts with these small washers in order to secure them to the threaded holes on the larger portion of the new Airbox. All right, once you have the Airbox assembled, the next step is installing the weather stripping. You might have a little bit of excess once you got this installed, so it's helpful to have a trim tool. All right, now that your heat shield is all set up, you can install your filter adapter, this plastic O-ring looking thing here. In order to tighten this down to the heat shield, you're going to need to grab the 2 other Allen head bolts in the kit. You'll want to set those up with crush washers and flat washers. Once you got this tightened down, you can also install the first of the 2 rubber couplers for the intake tube. For that, you're going to need the 2 medium-sized clamps in the kit, and you'll also need an 8mm socket to tighten those down. All right, now that our heat shield and our couplers and adapters are all set up, we're going to install the brackets to secure the heat shield inside of our truck. Now again, since we're using the 2013 or newer model year, we're going to need the spacer for one of our brackets. You're going to grab the remaining hex head bolts, as well as the nylon locking nuts and the flat washers in the kit. To tighten all this stuff down, you're going to need a 10mm socket and a 10mm wrench. All right, so everything on our heat shield is finally ready to go. Now we can install it in the truck. To secure the heat shield inside the engine bay, we have to loosen 2 bolts. I'm gonna go ahead and show you where those bolts are located. To loosen those, you're gonna need a 13mm socket. And if you're using a power tool like me, it's helpful to have an extension because it is a tight space. So like I said, there's 2 bolts inside the engine bay that we have to remove in order to secure our Airbox. One of those bolts is located right here, and it's actually holding the factory Airbox mounting plate in place. So again, go ahead and use your 13mm socket to pull that one, and I'll show you guys where the other one is. So the other bolt that's kind of hidden is located right down here underneath the radiator cover and behind this AC line. Again, it's a pretty tight space, so if you're using a power tool, it's helpful to have an extension and a swivel. All right, so once you got those 2 bolts removed, you can install your heat shield and then you can reinstall those 2 bolts. When you put this in here, it is a squeeze. You want to make sure this long bracket goes between the AC lines and the inside of the fender itself. All right, now that we have our heat shield installed, we can move on with installing our intake tube. But before we do that, we're gonna address the whole crankcase ventilation hose thing. Now, I mentioned earlier that you can actually avoid cutting this if you want to do so. It's pretty straightforward. All you gotta do is grab the provided tubing in the kit that's designed to install on here, and you're gonna grab the elbow barb fitting as well. You wanna cut a 5-inch section leading into the barb fitting, and you wanna leave about a 9-inch section leading out of it. That's gonna allow you to bypass cutting this entirely, and I'll show you guys how this installs in the truck in a little bit. Now, once you got that set up, you also wanna install the straight barb fitting into the intake tube. That 9-inch section is gonna connect here. So once you got the barb fitting set up and you got all your hosing cut and you got this little setup like I have here, you want to tighten all this stuff together using the provided clamps in the kit. These are the smallest clamps in the kit, and you want to tighten these down with an 8mm socket. All right, so once you got everything tightened down on our little tubing assembly, you want to secure the 5-inch end of the assembly onto the end of the crankcase ventilation hose like I'm doing now. You want to make sure you have one of the small clamps attached to it, but you want to leave it loose. We want this thing to have a little bit of play so it can spin freely like I'm doing right now. That way, once we secure it to the intake tube, we can tighten down this clamp, and we're also going to throw one on this end and tighten it down to the intake tube itself. All right, now that we got our crankcase ventilation hose and our engine cover reinstalled, we can finally install our intake tube. Again, to tighten down all the clamps on the intake tube, you'll need that 8mm socket. All right, now that we have our intake tube installed, we can install the extension on our crankcase ventilation hose to the barb fitting on the intake tube itself. Before you do that, make sure you throw that smallest band clamp onto the extension. Then once you got the extension connected to the barb fitting, tighten it down with your little 8mm socket. All right, now that we've got our crankcase ventilation reconnected, we can finally install our air filter, and we can also install the extension for our intake temperature sensor. The kit comes with 2 of these extensions, so just go ahead and test fit the connections to make sure you have the right one. To tighten down the air filter, you'll need that same 8mm socket. So once you got your breather hose and your temperature sensor plugged in, that actually wraps up our install. It also wraps up my review of K&N's Series 63 AirCharger cold air intake fitting your 09 to 18 Ram 1500 with the 5.7 Hemi. I'm Travis, thanks for watching, and for all things Ram, keep it right here at AmericanTrucks.com.